Hello and welcome to Consciousness Central 2018, coming to you from the Science of Consciousness Conference here in sunny Tucson, Arizona. I'm your host, Nick Day, and in this year's series of 5 programs, we'll be talking to some of the main plenary presenters on a wide variety of topics, including artificial intelligence and robotics, the latest findings in psychedelic research, what that inner voice in your head might be all about. We ask, can consciousness ever be reduced to computation? And explore what came first, evolution or consciousness? We'll drop in on the poster sessions and various other events happening around the conference, and we'll have a comprehensive roundup of the daily plenary sessions from TSC Executive Director Stuart Hameroff. All this and more in this 2018 series of Consciousness Central. Welcome. Very pleased and honored to have with me today Jimo Borjigin. She is from the University of Michigan, Professor of Neuroscience. Welcome.
Thank you.
And coming back for another turnaround, obviously we didn't scare him off too badly last time, Anil Seth from the University of Sussex. He is also a Professor of Neuroscience. And you have both presented here, I believe. We are talking about the relationship between psychedelics and consciousness. Psychedelics, they're for so many years a taboo subject. They're obviously demonized at government level, frustrating for neuroscientists and people who found that whole area very, very interesting and a very valuable area of research from psychology, psychiatry, everything, clinical settings. And perhaps even we might say from a recreational point of view, we call it that, just exploration of consciousness. But it seems as if the whole mood has changed and we seem to be entering perhaps another golden era. Would you say?
I hope so, but I think it's not something I know a huge amount, but I worry that it's still a little bit fragile. I mean, there's not many groups that are actively working on this, and speaking for myself anyway, we're just analysing data that's collected from other groups. We're not using the psychedelic drugs ourselves. And the wind can change rapidly, I think, and if it changes back, it would be a great shame. Because looking back, I think it was a great tragedy and a big missed opportunity that research into these drugs was outlawed or certainly put on the fringe for so long. Both, as you said, both because of the growing evidence now for their clinical and therapeutic benefit, and also, and this is more where my interest comes in, for the unique window they provide on understanding the neural basis of conscious perception generally, because they change one's conscious experience so dramatically, but in a way that's still quite controlled. And you can then just study what happens in the brain while these changes in conscious experience are happening. So hopefully this is the start of a very productive line of research, both clinically and in basic science. But it would be dangerous to take that for granted.
Excellent. Jimo, you're at University of Michigan. I gather your area of interest is endogenous DMT, dimethyltryptamine.
Correct, yeah.
That's known generally as being one of the most powerful psychedelics, or the most powerful psychedelic. Mm-hmm. People who take that in sufficient quantities have incredible experiences, almost indescribable, but it also occurs naturally being endogenous. It's a naturally occurring chemical in the body, biochemical.
Right.
What's your research all about?
Well, we published a paper in 2013 showing that a DMT is secreted from the living rat pineal gland. That attracted a lot of attention from media, from readers, and I was actually taken back by that because I wasn't the first author, I wasn't the last author. I submitted a sample to my collaborators, and it was collaboration went very well, and they showed that it's there. And then after that, I started reading more about the DMT, endogenous DMT. Why is endogenous DMT such a fascinating thing to study? And then I realized that exogenous DMT is profound effect in human consciousness, like Anil just described. Thinking if the endogenous DMT is endogenously made, then we have the innate capacity to generate that level of consciousness within our body without using any drugs, right? Suggesting really consciousness that maybe psychedelic neurons everywhere in our own brain. How does that work is something that I'm very fascinated by. So we wanted to explore the molecular basis of consciousness in a way. So first we have to find out whether there's any enzymes that make DMT in our brain or in rat's brain in our animal model, and to find out what are the other supporting systems, signaling mechanism for DMT to even be able to function as an endogenous neurotransmitter. So that's why I'm here and kind of sharing our latest, hottest discovery that we made, and it's still unpublished, but it's been moving very fast. I think hopefully within foreseeable future, and this can be in the mainstream neuroscience research, and showing that defect in the system could really lead to mental disorders.
Ah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we speculate what's the purpose? Is there like an adaptive purpose for DMT in brain function?
That's a really good question. So I think in psychiatry, people have been following the serotonergic system for years and years, decades, and we know a lot about the serotonin receptors. We know about a lot about how the serotonin synthesis and secretion is regulated. Everybody thought a serotonergic system might be underlying the mental disorders. So we have there's just tons of literature out there studying it, but we still don't really have very good handle on psychiatric disorders in humans. A lot of psychiatric mental disorders are untreatable. There's very little effective drugs available. And I think that unlike the serotonergic system, which is in the brainstem, okay, within the brainstem, there are other neuronal systems that are essential, together with the serotonergic system, essential for survival. And yet, unlike those, DMT system seems to be expressed in all over the cortex. Okay, so the DMT neurons we found not only in the frontal cortex, the parietal cortex, and the occipital cortex, all this really cortical region you think is involved in higher order brain functions, as well as the cortical regions and thalamus and really everywhere. So we think maybe the DMT system has more like the molecular glue of binding the discrete local information hubs to create synergistic, coherent conscious information that is distinct from a serotonergic system in the brainstem. So I think the serotonergic system in the brainstem more essential for survival of animals, evolutionary conserved, whereas dopamine and DMT-ergic system, I just gave it the name, the DMT-ergic system may really be involved in higher order brain function. So defective and DMT-ergic system itself could really be the foundation of mental disorders.
So I know with one of the interesting things about LSD, I suppose, is the fact that it's a typical transformational dose is so tiny. It's such a tiny amount, micrograms, and not so many of those. And yet, obviously, it has this profound effect, transformational effect. And I gather it does this by interrupting serotonin pathways or something like that. Could you just...
In a sense, one aspect of this kind of work is that it involves the pharmacological level much more than other manipulations of consciousness. So, in my lab at Sussex, most of what we do is, we show people different images, and sometimes they see them, sometimes they don't, or we might stimulate the brain with magnetic pulses using transcranial magnetic stimulation to inhibit part of the brain or activate it transiently. But none of these things really modulate specific aspects of the underlying pharmacology, whereas something like LSD or psilocybin will do that. that's great because the neurochemical level is hugely important, and all the interactions between the different neurotransmitter systems and global properties of brain dynamics and then behavior and perception are very, very difficult to unpick. What we've been trying to do by working with Robin and Suresh Muthukumaraswamy on their imaging data from LSD is fill in this middle gap. So yes, we know more or less what the pharmacological effects are, where the serotonin receptors are in the brain and so on, and so there are localized effects there. But then, as you say, there are very, very profound and global effects on perception and experience, both of the world and of the self. So that suggests that the effects, that the local effects that the compounds are having give rise to quite global effects in changes in brain dynamics, because we see such global effects on perception. So what we've been doing is analyzing mainly data from magnetoencephalography, or MEG, which gives very good time resolution and reasonably good spatial resolution about the activity of populations of neurons, their actual when they fire, when they don't fire. And what we want to understand is what happens to the global patterns of brain activity, and more interestingly, I think, how different parts of the brain communicate with each other. Because connecting brain activity to perception and experience isn't just a matter of saying, oh, you've got, your visual cortex is on or off or high or low. It's really about how information is flowing between different regions in the brain.
This is a fascinating subject. Hopefully we'll pick it up again at a future conference. And thank you both. Here we are at the first of the poster sessions, or TSC 2018, and I'm with, let me see, your name is Eric Campbell.
Eric Campbell, yeah.
Eric. So Eric, you have a poster here. Could you run us through it in a fairly brief and brisk manner, but still do it justice?
Yes, I can do the first thing at least. So I think we've got great evidence that sacred values are vital for all human groups, and sacred values are those that are they're set apart and forbidden, so they're not profane. They're really not supposed to be questioned. I think there's increasing awareness, as referenced by these three popular sources. There's a growing awareness that our sacred beliefs and values are explained by their ability to allow us to cooperate in really large human groups. And I think that the nature of sacred values is such that they really can't stand that kind of awareness. They can't stand, they don't work if we think, oh, the reason I believe in these sacred values is that they help us cooperate, because that's a kind of profane benefit. It's not a sacred kind of, it's not consistent with their being experienced as sacred to have that kind of explanation. So I'm saying, look, there's a need for some kind of sacred value that can actually withstand an awareness of its own nature. And I think the best candidate, or at least the most prominent candidate, is awareness itself, awareness of ourselves, of our own minds, and awareness of other people. And the nice thing is, awareness has divine origins in Western tradition of Socrates and know thyself, and that's a kind of third personal self-knowledge. But also in the Buddhist tradition, there's arguably the fundamental core value of Buddhist tradition is a kind of first personal awareness of one's own body and mind and ongoing thoughts.
Excellent, thank you very much, Eric. What's your name?
My name is Guru Prasanna Satsangi.
And where are you from?
I am from India.
Whereabouts in India?
Agra.
Agra. Now, could you tell us briefly, but in wonderful, exquisite detail, something about your poster?
Yes, sure. So I am in grade 8 now, and my poster is inspired from what I studied from class 6 to grade 8. So since class 6, we used to study about the South Asian culture. And when we used to study, I realized that the South Asian culture is not really the South Asian culture. It's not pure. It is a mix of the invasions, explorations, and migrations that the South Asian region has endured. So the culture is very diverse and rich. So when a tribe is introduced in a certain region, the cultural exchanges take place. And the main aspects of culture there are 7 aspects of culture, like the social organization, forms of government, economic systems, traditions, beliefs, literature, arts, and religion. So all these things are impacted by the influence of a tribe. So my poster is about how the South Asian countries like India, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, how their culture, which existed in the ancient times, was impacted by the foreign invasions, explorations, and migrations, and what is now. Because of these invasions, there were cultural changes. But what happened is the religious traditions and bearings, religious traditions were having and still have more bearing to rituals and beliefs that were exchanged during the invasions, explorations, and migration rather than God realization. Because now we are actually invaded by the technology, and it's possible that after some time the technology would be ruling us. So when the technology would be ruling us, probably the humans would realize more about the existence of God, and they would be more particular about God realization rather than the religious beliefs and traditions. And this is what my poster is about.
Thank you very much for your time, and good luck with your poster. So I would like to welcome to Consciousness Central Charles Ferneyhough. Charles is a psychologist at Durham University in the United Kingdom. And Charles has given a plenary talk here entitled The Voices in Our Heads. So Charles, can you tell us what you mean by that?
If you ask people to reflect on their inner experience, and what I mean by that is what is going on in their heads as they're going about their business, as they're walking across the golf course, as they're chopping carrots in the kitchen. People tend to say there's an awful lot of language, speech, an internal conversation that seems to perform all sorts of different roles for us. And my interest really is where that internal conversation comes from. What is it doing? What are these functions of what we call inner speech? And what is it like? What forms does it take? What varieties does it come in? I started out as a developmental psychologist, so that's somebody who studies babies and young children. And my PhD research was about looking at how children use words to regulate their own behaviour, to talk themselves through a problem, to just accompany what they're doing as they're playing with some toys. And thinking about the functions that kind of speech has. We call that kind of speech private speech. And you'll see it if you walk into any nursery or playgroup anywhere in the world. You'll see young children yabbering away to themselves as they play. We also do it as adults. You know, it's not a crazy thing to talk to yourself. It seems to be something that is very useful, that performs all sorts of useful functions. And my inspiration in this research is a Russian psychologist known as Vygotsky, who argued that this process of talking to yourself out loud is the precursor to this internal silent conversation that many of us seem to have with ourselves. And his theory about it was nice and simple. The idea is that babies are born into a social world. They start interacting with other people through gestures and then through language, really from as soon as they get going. And over time, those social dialogues become gradually internalized to become dialogues that the child can conduct for herself without anybody else needed. So you'll see a child talking to herself as she works her way through a problem. That's the stage of private speech. And then there's a bit more internalization, there's a bit more transformation, and it all goes completely silently up here. So it turns into this silent inner speech, this silent conversation that many of us report having with ourselves.
About how old is that, just roughly?
The peak of private speech is somewhere between age 2 and age 6 or 7, probably,
okay.
very roughly.
Yeah.
So we think that kids, probably from earlier than 6 or 7, undoubtedly from earlier than 6 or 7, but probably not as young as babies just starting to learn language. It probably takes time to develop. And then as adults, we can turn our inner speech back outwards, so we can take those internal thoughts and say them out loud, then that's the stage of private speech that I mentioned. So social speech, private speech, inner speech. And there are certain implications of this theory, one of the most important being that if it all starts out as social exchanges, social dialogue, then this stuff, this silent stuff, should also have the structure of a dialogue. It should really be a conversation with yourself when you talk to yourself. And that has all sorts of ramifications, all sorts of interesting questions that it raises that you can test through research.
I seem to note that a lot of people, when something on the inside comes out, it's a curse. It's usually like a sudden realization that something went wrong, and you hear them kind of swearing under their breath a little bit. Are we suggesting that most thought is in language?
I try to avoid the term thought. I think it's too vague.
Okay.
It means too many different things, and nobody ever tries to define what it means. So I try to avoid it. And I think questions like, is thinking fundamentally linguistic? People have been arguing about this for 2,000 years or more, and I'm not sure we're getting anywhere. What I would rather do is say, what are the different kinds of inner experience? What are the different kinds of cognitive process? And which involve language and which don't? So I think there is a kind of inner experience that does involve language, that has certain functions. We can test those functions out. And that's really where I see research going. I think we should be talking about different kinds of inner speech. I think we should be talking about things like visual imagery and memory and things we can be more specific about and get rid of this term thinking.
Okay. Okay.
It's very hard to avoid using it.
Well, it is.
I've probably
rather,
used
isn't
it 10 times already in this conversation. But we can use it in its everyday sense. But as psychologists and neuroscientists, we need to tighten up a bit.
When we hear the voices in our heads, should we listen to them? When you say we talk to ourselves, I'm always curious, like who's talking to whom, sort of thing. You know, what part? There's one. It seems we split somehow our psyche into these. You know, the talker and the listener. It's kind of an interesting process. You know, this separation.
Yeah, I mean, the Vygotskian view is that thinking is social because it comes from social interaction. So of course it's going to be social. Of course there are going to be different people in your head, and that is a challenge for Anglo-American philosophy in all sorts of ways, but an interesting challenge. And I think the answer is that the voices in your head can be very positive. They can be very helpful. They can help you to do stuff, but they can be negative as well. Just even sort of fairly kind of ordinary depression and anxiety can involve negative inner speech, and then more serious forms even more so. And of course we've talked about hearing voices, which can be a very debilitating experience. So it's a double-edged sword, I think. There are pluses and minuses to this chatter that goes on in our heads.
I think so much in our culture is a sort of a negative, isn't it? So self-critical voice. We hear, you screwed up again. You're always this kind of. People get locked into this sort of quite negative self-chatter.
I think so, and although I don't have a kind of 12-step plan to making your inner voices more positive, I don't go in for that sort of thing. I do think that if people learn just a bit more about the science of inner speech, they can become more aware of where it comes from and why it's the way it is, and that's going to be helpful.
Could you say sort of don't take yourself so seriously? Is that fair?
I think just be aware that inner speech comes in different forms, and sometimes it can take some alarming forms. Right. And I think just being able to step back and say, that's just kind of what inner speech is like, is potentially beneficial and even therapeutic. Wonderful.
And with that, Charles, I'd like to say thank you very much for talking to us this afternoon, and good luck with your research.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. That's Charles Ferneyhough. What's your name?
Kyla.
Kyla, and you've been here how many times now for TSC?
Since the beginning.
Since the beginning, which is like what, 1990?
But I think my first one was 96.
So 96. So you're a veteran of this. You've
I
seen a lot of
am.
changes. How would you describe some of the changes over the years?
I have been waiting for the East-West thing to happen, and that's finally happening, so that's exciting. The East-West Forum is cool, and bringing in broader ideas of consciousness. There's still a lot to be defined in terms of consciousness or self-awareness or self-reflexive consciousness and all that, but we're getting there.
Okay, so what's your name?
Emily?
Hi, Emily. And tell me, is this your first time at Science of Consciousness conference?
Yes.
Yes, it is. And what attracted you? What brought you here?
So I work for Tucson Local Media. It's a local media outlet, so I don't know how I got lucky enough to just get to come to this conference to cover it as a journalist, because I would have wanted to come anyway, but I don't know if I would have been able to. So yeah, I was a philosophy minor in college. The science of the brain and the philosophy of the brain really interests me. So yeah.
Okay, so you are actually a kind of a media person yourself. You're reporting on the conference.
Yeah.
For who are you reporting for?
Tucson Local Media. We own the Tucson Weekly, Inside Tucson Business, a couple other print publications.
and will we see an article or something? Where will that appear? Yes.
It should be on in the Tucson Weekly, yeah. Or
And when is the Tucson Weekly, the edition?
It comes out on Thursdays, but it would probably come out next Thursday after the conference is over. We have online that runs more often too. So.
Excellent. We'll look out for that. Thank you very much, Emily. Well, I'm standing here with the co-founder and executive director, I think, of Toward the Science of Consciousness, this wonderful series of conferences that have been going on for nearly 25 years, Stuart Hameroff. Hi, Stuart.
Hi, Nick. How you doing?
Hi. So, first of all, before we get going on the plenaries, what's your guiding principle for this year? What's the theme for this year's conference?
Consciousness. But all aspects. So we brought in some new stuff. We've emphasized language this year, partly because Noam Chomsky has come to the U of A, University of Arizona in Tucson, and we have some authorities in that. More physics, more quantum stuff, technology, neuroscience, philosophy. We kind of, our approach is interdisciplinary, all different approaches, because consciousness is a common thing among so many fields. So we want to bring it in from all different directions, and it works.
And I must say, number one, we'd like to thank you for hosting us, Consciousness Central. It's been wonderful. Number two, for staying the course for so long. Well, congratulations on that. This is an amazing series of conferences. I think you've kind of changed the world, to be honest, if I may say, without being a little too congratulatory there. But anyway, now let's talk about the plenaries.
Yes.
We kicked off on Monday with two giants in the field,
Yes.
Jean-Pierre Changeux, and of course Noam Chomsky.
Right.
What happened in that plenary?
Well, it was set up by the linguistics guys at the U of A. Noam Chomsky is a famous historic figure in developing the field of language and linguistics. And Jean-Pierre Changeux is a noted neuroscientist, molecular biologist, geneticist, famous for developing and characterizing the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which when I was in med school was a big deal, that we knew what this protein actually looked like. And he then went into neuroscience and was worked on a theory called the global neuronal workspace with Stanislav Dehaene, which takes Bernie Barr's idea of a global workspace and puts neuroanatomy on it, and claims to be a neuroanatomical model of where consciousness might reside. And he's also done a lot of work in genetics, evolution, epigenetics, and recently has developed a hierarchical theory of the mind from going downward in size and speed, upwards in speed, downward. So a number of people have this hierarchical idea, and he has 4 stages, but it winds up in the genes. I would disagree with that, because I think you have to get to the microtubules, which is where I think consciousness arises, but that's his hierarchical view. Now, Chomsky is, as I said, famous for language linguistics, and he dabbles in political science, and in a major way, of
Just
course.
a bit.
Just a bit, yeah. And but I kind of look at their dialogue as comparable to the discussion or contrast between Piaget, who claimed that consciousness and language and logic develop, that you're born basically a tabula rasa,
And through experience, you develop logic and language that continues at least through adolescence. So a blank slate, and everything happens upwards from that. Now Chomsky, on the other hand, follows more the ideas of the philosopher Jerry Fodor, for example, who says that there's something innate, that we come with some kind of logic intrinsic to our brains. And he puts in the context of language in terms of syntax. So if, for example, you take a sentence can be broken down into phrases, phrases can be broken down into words, words can be broken down into syllables or phonemes, and somehow meaning arises. And many, many years ago, Chomsky came up with this idea of X-bar structure, of branching tree-like structures. We start with a sentence and you break it down into these components, and a tree-like branching going down till you get to the syllables and the phonemes at the bottom. And a number of people have looked for this in terms of neural networks in the brain, but have been unable to find it. And he kind of pulled away from that and went to something simpler called the merge hypothesis, which is kind of just the basis of that, where two things come together to make one. And so merge or X-bar are all these idea of branching hierarchical structure. And by the way, as an aside, I've suggested to Chomsky over the last year that these X-bar structures might be happening in microtubules. And I'm trying to get him to work with me on a model of that. But whether that happens or not, we don't know. But that was kind of the essence of the debate, I thought. And it was gentlemanly and congenial until kind of at the end. They got a bit of a squabble, which we love, of course. And we're quite literally fighting over the microphone as they were sitting next to each other, because Ferneyhough wouldn't give up the idea that everything is kind of mechanical and mechanistic, and there's no real target or end zone. There's nothing magical that happens to produce consciousness, and that it's just a natural product of what the brain does, kind of like what Dan Dennett says and what a lot of other people say. But that raises a lot of problems. It makes consciousness epiphenomenal, takes away the possibility of free will, doesn't really solve anything, in my opinion. Other people would agree with them. Chomsky doesn't take a stance really on what it is in the brain that does consciousness, but he does take the view that there's something innate, there's something intrinsic and built in, something structural in biology at some level. And so that was the essence of the debate. It was quite a contrast, and like you said, there were two giants in the field, and there were commentary by Tom Bever and Massimo Piatelli-Palmarini, who were both professors at the U of A in linguistics. And Massimo was a student many, many years ago of Ferneyhough, and Tom was a student many, many years ago of Chomsky. And in fact, Tom was instrumental in bringing Chomsky to the U of A. And Tom is also co-organizer of the conference and vice director of the Center for Consciousness Studies. So they kind of set up the session, and it was unusual that we started on a Monday night. Usually we start Tuesday, and it worked out quite well, I thought. And people loved it, and it was a great evening.
So now let's talk about Tuesday plenaries. And Tuesday, I think there was still one plenary, I believe.
Right, we had workshops in the morning, and then we had a Tuesday afternoon plenary, which would normally be the opening session, and it was on psychedelics, a very popular topic.
Psychedelics is a big draw always. It's a field that seems to be very attractive to people and is opening up, and somewhat of a renaissance since there's 40 years in the wilderness due to legal constraints, but nowadays they're going great guns.
Many people got initiated their interest in consciousness through their own psychedelic experiences. So I think it's a big draw.
Exactly, and we're very fortunate to have had a couple of young rising stars in the field, one of them being Robin. I guess he's seems to be somebody who's put a lot of time and effort into psychedelics.
Robin Carhart Harris, working with David Nutt at Johns Hopkins. Robin is at, I think, Imperial College in London, and they've been, they fought the bureaucratic battle to get approval to study psychedelics with the overall kind of long-term goal of using them in medical treatment. And there's been a lot of use of ketamine, for example, for depression, and LSD and so forth. So we don't know where this is going, but it needs to be studied. So Robin was here in 2012 and gave the first study on that he did on giving subjects, volunteers, intravenous psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, while they were in an MRI scanner. And so they had to be still, and they asked them later, they gave them a questionnaire later to determine their mental state while they were scanning their brain, and they were hallucinating, they were basically tripping. And they knew all the questions to ask, and it was quite clear that they were having a hallucinogenic experience. Of course, the other group, the placebo group, were not, so there was a clear distinction. And I think they were expecting to see in the MRI, which measures blood flow, blood oxygen levels, which reflects metabolism, they were expecting, I think, to see the brain light up like a pinball machine. But it didn't. It actually looked kind of cold and dark, like they were asleep or not there. And similarly, the EEG was very slow and almost wiped out. And that was somewhat surprising. More recent work is something like that. It's a little bit more complex, but basically there is this suppression of metabolic activity and absence of EEG. And that remains a bit hard to understand. My opinion is that what happens under those circumstances, the consciousness goes to a deeper level in the hierarchy, down into the quantum level, in the microtubules or something like that, and the membranes are silent. So without membrane activity, you don't need energy, so you don't need that much blood flow, and there's no EEG because the membranes are silent, but the patients are having vivid experience, conscious experience at a deeper level. Now cognitively, they're not so hot because their membranes are silent. You wouldn't want them driving you home. But in terms of their experience they're having, they're having a great time. They're having an intense time at least. So more recently, he's done more work on that with not only psilocybin, but with LSD and DMT. And he talked a little bit about the classical pharmacology of LSD binding to the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, particular serotonin receptor, and they believe that that's the mechanism, because if they give a blocker of that same receptor, then there's no effect. And that's somewhat that's strong evidence, but it could also be that both the active ingredient, the LSD, and the blocker are getting inside the cell and acting on the microtubules. That's my opinion, a minority opinion. The classical view is it acts as serotonin receptors. That's a little bit surprising because we have a lot of serotonin drugs that don't do anything like that. But anyway, he talked about the pharmacology, and he talked about more recent studies with DMT, LSD, and psilocybin, and talked a little bit about future applications in medicine of these drugs, the potential applications, not very much. And of course, a lot of people are doing that. We need something new for depression, for this and for that. And so it was a very interesting talk. He's a very polished speaker, very engaging guy, and we're very fortunate to have people like him working in this field within the academic community, doing real science that gets published in real journals, and breaking this barrier of taboo for these types of drugs.
Absolutely. And who else was in that session?
The second speaker was Jimo Borjigin from the University of Michigan, from George Mashour's work. She spoke last time on near-death experiences, or the neural correlate of near-death experiences in animals, which is very interesting. And this time she spoke about endogenous DMT. So DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca and the most potent psychedelic known. And it turns out, it's been postulated for a long time, and she basically proved that it is synthesized in the brain. So we have endogenous DMT floating around in our brain, produced in the pineal gland. And she was trying to get at, what causes its release, and where does it go? What's its target in the brain? And it may also bind to these serotonin receptors, but I don't think anybody really knows. It could also get inside the cell. So I asked her if she knew of the study that came out recently where they gave DMT to these cerebral organoids, these little clumps of neurons that aren't mini brains at a very tiny level. And they found that they sprouted extensions based on microtubule polymerization. She was unaware of that, so I'm going to send her the paper. But it was a really interesting talk, and DMT is a fascinating molecule. And it's good to know we have it floating around. So whatever we do to float our own boat may be causing, endorphins, okay, we know about that, but we may be actually producing DMT also.
And I believe the Anil Seth also?
Anil Seth is a very high, well-regarded neuroscientist from Sussex, Brighton in England, University of Sussex. He has a Center for Consciousness Studies. I spoke there last summer to his group. It was very interesting, a very good group. And he collaborated with on the LSD studies with Robin, and he did an analysis. One of the things he does is analyzing brain activity in terms of connectivity and causality. What causes what? And he did extensive analysis, and the conclusion was that under LSD and the other psychedelics, that the brain becomes more diversified. That rather than having one coherent picture of the scene that we have, that there's all this other stuff going on all over the place. It isn't really united, it's kind of fragmented. So consciousness becomes fragmented or diversified. And he put it in terms of entropy and order and disorder and so forth. So that was interesting, applying more or less standard techniques of analyzing neural activity in the brain to the psychedelic state. It was a very good talk.
Excellent. So that sounds like an awesome session. We were fortunate enough to talk to Anil and Jimo today.
Oh,
a very, very good conversation with them. So they obviously told us a lot more about what they're up to.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Stuart, very much for that roundup. Can we come and check in with you again another day?
Absolutely. I'm here all week.
All right. He's here all week. Thank you very much, Stuart Hameroff. And that's it for this first programme in our 2018 series. Don't forget, there's plenty more to enjoy, another 4 programmes, talking about artificial intelligence, evolution, psychedelics, and much more. Until then, this is Nick Day saying thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Goodbye for now.